right, so we're going to look at our last examples of some post-war, right, post-1945 artists who sort of defy classic categorization. Another of these artists associated with the women's movement and who's sometimes considered a pioneer of what we would call attribution art is Barbara Kruger. And she's one of the first to really create gallery art where she's taking ads and taking sort of these captions and really twisting these in a provocative way. Somehow this has turned into entire greeting card industry since the 1980s. But when she did this in the mid 20th century, it was considered pretty edgy in the 60s, 70s, into the 80s here. And usually she was speaking about gender and in particular media pressure for women to have certain appearances, to buy products, things like plastic surgery and some of her famous ones include like "you shop, therefore you are" and things. A great example of very abstract minimalism, again, sort of opposite of someone like Barbara Kruger, not interested in addressing political issues or being known as a female artist first and foremost. Agnes Martin, very famous for these gray and beige tone grid pieces. And this one known as The Wall, which is based on these paintings which are nailed onto the main canvas, giving us an example of her art, which some people have actually defined as sort of mystical. She ultimately moved out to New Mexico, like Georgia O'Keeffe, and had a famously sort of interesting isolated existence there. So some going total abstraction, some artists going more overtly political. One of the most interesting artists who just a few years ago hit a record-breaking high in terms of sales is Kerry James Marshall. And he has done all sorts of work, but probably his most famous pieces from, in particular, the 80s and 90s have focused on everyday images of Black individuals going about their lives. Sometimes these are deliberately political pieces with very clear messages, and other times they're people on a picnic or a camp out for kids or in a salon where these everyday scenes are less overtly political. But gorgeous work, and the outlines on his work show that he sometimes uses collage in his pieces. And even when he's creating a painting without that element, you can usually see its impact. Isamu Noguchi is an American artist who's a famous landscape architect as well as sculptor, and he got very involved in doing interior design projects, in particular abstract lamps at one point. This is Octetra, one of his pieces that travel, that's painted concrete. And you can see that sort of minimalist geometric shapes that Noguchi becomes particularly famous for. It was originally outside Cathedral in Spoleto, Italy, but it's been traveling around the US in recent years. And this was designed so that kids could play on it in addition to being a piece of art. We have another sort of minimalist, Eva Hesse, coming along as what's first example of what's sometimes called post-minimalism, although again, I wouldn't necessarily confine her to a single movement. Her work often is abstract sculpture involving industrial material. So not traditional minimalism in that she's using complex materials, she's putting them in interesting ways, not quite as spare or Spartan, but these are actually resin-based sort of canisters. They're about the size of, I don't know, like a bouquet of flower vases. And this is one of her themes. We also see a lot of sculpture with interestingly coiled ropes And Hesse's famous for these industrial sort of style pieces, which is, I think, like Nevelson, even though this is very abstract, playing with some gender expectations in terms of what women are going to sculpt with. Well, another artist who sometimes gets categorized as a neo-expressionist, although again, not entirely sure that he'd be comfortable with that label, is Keith Haring. Keith Haring is famous for these little outlined dancing figures. And although he has these little outlined folks doing all sorts of things, some of his most famous work was as part of ACT UP. And ACT UP was a group of artists who created murals and posters designed to combat AIDS epidemic, particularly in the 1980s and the 1990s. And Haring very involved with that. So although you see these in sort of goofy, casual ways, I know I used to see them often when I lived in California as car stickers. ACT UP doing incredible things to spread awareness about AIDS when that pandemic was at its, or epidemic was at its height in the 80s, and people were dying because of the stigma associated with the disease and talking about the disease. So very tied into gay rights movements at the time. If Haring is a neo-expressionist involved with bright colors and simple, simplistic figures that aren't abstract but point towards abstraction, like the expressionists of the 20s, then Jean-Michel Basquiat probably falls into the same category, and you will see him occasionally described as a neo-expressionist. Jean-Michel Basquiat came from parents who were Haitian and Puerto Rican, and as a New Yorker, he sometimes hung around with some of Andy Warhol's folks at the end of the period when Andy Warhol had what he called his factory of artists. But Basquiat was really inspired and influenced not just by abstract artists, but he spent a lot of time playing with notions of street art and graffiti as a form of abstract art. Bird on Money is an example of one of his paintings dedicated to the incredible jazz musician Charlie Parker. And Basquiat was wildly popular before dying young of a heroin overdose, but managed to produce incredibly political art that dealt with issues of race, class, and political life in the 1980s in New York. Last two artists here, British artist Cy Twombly. Twombly is famous for creating abstract pieces with what really sort of look like scribbles. Sometimes he's described as a calligrapher because it looks like handwriting, and even when he has more traditional abstract paintings, they often have legible writing that has words mixed into them. So the idea of combining abstraction, art, and language is Twombly's sort of expertise and what he's famous for. And the final artist for our post-war art section, remember we're going to get into 21st century art in our next lecture, so don't worry, they're coming, is Betty Saar. And Betty Saar's a fascinating artist because she asks important questions about gender, about race, and about social class. But what she does is she takes the idea of assemblage sculptures. In particular, we know she was inspired by Joseph Cornell's random boxes that we looked at. And she's going to put those together to engage with politics and identity. This is one of her most famous pieces, Black Girl's Window, where you have a woman looking out at the world and all of these symbols of what she sees above her. But very famous for other pieces, sometimes playing with notions of tarot or mystical spirituality. You'll also see a number of them that riff on very racist blackface characters and kitschy sculptures from pre-segregation era of sort of Aunt Jemima, what are called mammy figures. And she, in many cases, arms those symbols of racism, those creepy stereotypical sculptures with guns, and gives them names like Aunt Jemima's Revenge was one of her more famous pieces. So artists looking at all different elements of their own identities, of politics in work, of what the role of abstraction in art should be. A lot of ideas that emerged in the early 20th century being teased out by artists in the late 20th century. So what is the role of the artist? What is the role of art in society? All important questions that we are addressing.